Taking the trail of exploring RC crawling? Well, guess what? RC Crawlers Coffee brings you morning wisdom, the latest rig tunings, and pro tips that you'll need. So call out of bed and stick around.
Hey guys, we're back again with Eric.
How's it going?
El Padrino.
Introduce yourself, Eric.
My name is Eric Ogden. I'm with Res Concepts. Res Concepts, we make the Porkbelly. Yeah.
RES. This is where everything began.
Yeah.
Let's give a little background, quick story of how we all got here.
Sure. So during the pandemic time, probably the similar story with a lot of makers now. Things were closing. A lot of our tracks were shut down. And Res Concepts, RES, is actually founded by three friends, Ramel, Eric, myself, and Sean, who's still involved. And at that time, about 5 years ago, we were doing a lot of racing, or at least I was doing a lot of racing, a lot of 8 scale. And when the pandemic hit and things were almost non-existent as far as like where you could go, Sean is actually the one that was into crawling for quite a while. So he had always wanted me to get into crawling. And I did have a crawler. I had a SAX-10 III, and then I had something before that. It was actually from my buddy James. It was like a custom Spider Wheelie King axle build. And I honestly hadn't even driven it. I had it with high hopes to like try it out, but Wheelie King axles. I guess that's aging. That's aging the rig. But yeah, so I had that, and I had a SAX-10 III, but I never really took it out. And when racing stopped, that's when we started picking up crawling. And yeah, so Sean had around that time built a G-Speed Element, G10 rails, V3, and then put some Element axles on there. And it was a similar build to what Big Sung had done. He was crawling. Him and our other buddy Chris were crawling with Big Sung quite a bit. So he was helping them with the G-Speed build at the time, and then went crawling with them one day. I think it was. It wasn't Greystone. It was, I can't remember where it was. But they let me try the G-Speed build and basically hooked, right? So I brought my, what's up, Tony? Got my 10-3, and we actually took, I think this was what happened. We took my 10-3 axles apart, used the internals, and built my G-Speed. So we used the internals to build the capper axles, and then we used an FMM motor mount from TGH. We weren't quite doing a scale build, but we were looking for front bias, and I didn't know anything at that time. Sean was the one that was really crafting the setups, so he would kind of coach me through like a build. And even today, I tell people I drive a Sean setup. Like, this is a lot of his homework, and then I'll do my minor tuning, but really for the most part, like the lightweight setup that we like, the high front bias. I mean, that's from his experience. So I've adopted a lot of that into my style of build and even style of driving.
And that's going across the grain there on that style of build, because you're saying you go lightweight, and I mean, at the time, light rigs didn't crawl at the same time. And same thing with like rigidity. Everybody's about rigid chassis, heavy. Mm-hmm. Everything was just like completely opposite of what you guys came up with.
Yeah,
which is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, even our G speeds were pretty lightweight, and as soon as we got into that, and I think it didn't take long. There was about maybe 3 months with our V3s, and we were crawling at Linda Vista quite a bit. There was some things that I just really wanted, and one of the lines that we had started testing on was the rock wall, the redemption line, and you guys know about that one. But that was one of Sean, Chris, and Sung's lines that they were trying to do, and I think they were able to accomplish it, but really hard, you know. So that was kind of our first initial test at like, what can these crawlers do? What are they capable of? You know, that was around that time that ruptures were getting really popular with the...
They were hard to get.
They were hard to get, really popular.
Shit.
And coming from the racer world, we were actually, like, we're not strangers to the lightweight setups. We before crawling, we were actually taking Mugans at the time, Mugen 8-scale buggies, and we were basically stripping them down to run indoor. So a lot of the tracks that we were going to were allowing 8 scales to run as long as you can run 2S. So you'd run a short course setup, short course truck setup, 2S battery, and then a 2S motor. But these things are typically 7.5, 8 pounds. So we were trying to actually cut them down quite a bit to be really efficient. So we would do all kinds of stuff. We would do a lay down servo. Stop me if this sounds familiar. We would do a lay down servo right on the chassis. We would take the battery. We would get the battery as low as possible. We would take the ESC tray, ditch that. We would cut out even the rock guards. We would cut them out, or we would even make Lexan rock guards, right? And then we were looking for lightweight bodies, anything to drop the CG, lower the roll center, not roll center, but lower the weight, lighten it. At some point, I think Sean was even changing out all the screws to titanium. We were doing the ball studs to aluminum, all kinds of crazy stuff. So when I think about how we set up the Porkbellies now, a lot of it was from that, where we would just try to strip down as much as possible to what was necessary for the tire to work. So we would do a lot in 8 scale. You do a lot of tire changes, right? And I'll say this a lot: you tune for your terrain, or you tune for the track. So when I look at the Porkbelly, or at the time the G-Speed, I was thinking, how am I going to tune this for what I see the tires doing or not doing? And that kind of just evolved into a wish list of things within our setup, not just the chassis. And we had this. So part of the story is we went to Joshua Tree for some crawling, right? Like specifically to go out there. Like I was going to go for a camping trip, and then I told Sean, hey, I'm going to go crawl at Joshua Tree. You want to go down? And him and his wife and their son, they were like, yeah, sure. They came down for the weekend, and we crawled in some back section of Joshua Tree, found some amazing decayed granite boulders, huge slopes, really steep. And that was the first taste of like crawling high desert or like desert terrain. And it was definitely different. I mean, the lines out there were like, you'd see a boulder or a feature that was like 30 or 40 feet, right? Like you could scale this thing. So, at that time we had our 4-wheel steer Capras, and Sean's son had but he was driving his dad's Element G10 G-Speed build, V3 rails. And so we were crawling this boulder, and Sean's son would want to follow us on the lines and stuff, right? So there's this one line, and I have a video of it, and we're crawling. It's maybe like, 15, 20 feet up. And we would drive up to the top, just to the crown part, and we would do a U-turn and try to drive it back down, right? Mm-hmm. So our setups definitely seemed to work well. Our Capras were 4-wheel steer, so they definitely had
a tight turn.
They had tight turns, good weight in the back. Like we had them low. We did a lot of mods to them. And so Joshua would go up and try to follow us. And it was on one of the lines where he was trying to come back down. And that thing, that thing tumbled at least 15 feet or so, right? And luckily he had a Traxxas body on it. And I gotta say, the Traxxas stuff, the bodies, they're super tough. Yeah. So that thing cartwheeled down the boulder, landed right on the roof. And luckily it survived. But after that, me and Sean were talking about, man, there needs to be an LCG friendly, kid friendly option out there. Like if you just want something that's durable, where you could go drive it, it's inexpensive, like it just works. But if you crash, you didn't worry about a really nice, expensive carbon fiber chassis cracking, right? And at that time, you would hear stories about carbon fiber cracking on crawlers. So as people were progressing as far as driver skill and the type of lines that they were doing. Anyways, so yeah, I remember talking to him. We were getting boba somewhere, and we were talking about the idea of like, man, if you could find a material, like a RPM part. You guys remember RPM parts?
Yeah.
Dude, whatever the material, like some kind of nylon or whatever it was, like a flexible material that could take impact. Like imagine if we could find something like that. Called our buddy Ramel. And at that time, he was doing a lot of manufacturing for or designs for kayaks. So he had a CNC table. So we call him up and we're asking him about this, idea. And it was around that time we were already thinking about a design for something that we could swap our parts from the G-Speed to some different design, right? Like some kind of flavor that we were looking for. And somewhere in there, we came up with this Porkbelly, in the whole, like, it felt like a flash, right, of time that we were like crawling nonstop. It was a time where we would probably crawl 3 or 4 days a week, just to like do the setup. And that was early on. That was even with our Capras. And then we would go do a meetup on the weekends. Like if Bark had a crawl at, Linda Vista or Bean Hollow or somewhere else, or the creek on Tuesday. Yeah. Right. So we were doing those. And then we started going to other places like Bean Hollow, Greystone. And I was starting I had family up in Oregon, Washington. I was even traveling up there and bringing my crawlers. And, one day we started designing something with the flavor that we wanted. And it started to work. Actually, our first chassis, and I have it in the back, our first chassis was actually made out of carbon fiber that Ramel cut.
I remember seeing that.
Yeah, and it was thinner carbon fiber than you would typically see used for crawling. And it actually had flex. And so the story goes, a little bit of history, like we're used to tuning chassis flex not on crawlers. Like we actually do that from 8-scale buggies, from 10-scale buggies, from drift cars, and even before touring cars. Actually, when we first started really racing, we actually came from the touring car scene when Castle Hobbies was open, and doing a lot of parking lot racing. And at that time, we were driving the Yokomo YR4s, and the top plate of the Yokomo YR4 actually it's a 2-piece design. Actually, the YR4 maybe a 3-piece. The early one, and there's a spring in the middle, and you'd actually tune the tension of the top plate.
Like a coilover almost?
It was a coilover on the top. Actually, one of the versions actually had like a coilover. YR4,
yeah, because you can adjust the
YR4 2 could adjust the tension, right? And you can theoretically change the spring rate. Now it didn't have dampening at that time, and I think I did a version of a YR4 with a Yokomo Microshock, So I could change the dampening and the spring rate.
Oh.
But with that, you could change the standoffs on the top plate. So you could adjust where the flex happened within the chassis and then how much flex you had. And then with a combination of the spring setup, you can adjust a little bit of the dampening. But anyways, so we had started having that seed of thought in our designs where I'm looking at our rigs trying to do the rock wall, and the rock wall is hard. Like not many people even want to play on it. It's got a lot of organic material, a lot of slick rock. It's not forgiving. It's it's man-made, but it's got a lot of rock boulders that build up the wall, right? And so depending on the time of day, on the season, you might have a lot of debris on there, so that like you'll see a lot of like, it's pretty low traction.
Yeah.
And so
loose dirt, leaves.
Yeah. And before, when we used to set up our flat wheel rigs, we have all the braces, right? Like all the braces on there, because that's what we thought from the crawling world. And when we would watch this, especially when we would video, we would see a lot of that like traction loss as soon as a tire would spin.
It'll teeter-totter.
Yeah. And it was like, man, that tire's unloading or that side's unloading. Like, how can we figure out how to add a little bit of more articulation or forgiveness or whatever,
right. Without adding 100mm shock?
Yeah,
that's going to unload on
right.
you.
And we wanted to stick to the 2660 shock, right? 85 to 90 mil shock, around that range. So somewhere in there, we Ramel actually cut a polymer chassis. I remember this. Like at that time, it was hard to get carbon, right? So we were going from our carbon rail to, we had this idea about a kid-friendly chassis, to the, hey guys, I ran out of carbon, but let's still test the design, right? So we made some changes, and I think it was like a V3, and he cut it out of the polymer. And I remember I was at his house. We were, I swapped it over from our carbon rail to this white plastic, like, it looks cool, you know, it's thick cut, and then we were kind of...
That was the OG cut, man.
Yeah.
To this day, I still remember that because it was so odd looking compared to like what was out there.
Dude, super odd looking.
But it was...
I built it one weekend, and then I was telling the guys, I'm going to bring it Wednesday, right? I told Mel I'm going to bring it Wednesday for the crawl, and I was telling Sean about it. And as soon as I got there, we were in the parking lot and we're kind of waiting for everybody. So I pulled this thing out, and they're like, I remember one of the guys, he held it in his hand, and it did the floppy thing, right?
The wet noodles.
Yeah. He was like, holy crap, it's so flexible, you know? And then Sean sees it, and he's feeling it, and he's like, yeah, he kind of coined the phrase of like, it's like a wet noodle, you know? It's white, it's like kind of flopping around. And I actually still had all the braces, right? Like at least all the braces that I had remained. I probably went from 7 braces to like 5 braces. And
7?
Yeah. I mean,
and that's
when you think about it,
all the relief cuts too at that time. It was very minimal relief cuts.
But I mean, remember like old setups where you'd have 2 on the shock towers, and then you'd have 2
on each
one
end.
on each
Yeah,
end,
that's right.
That's
and
true.
then on our FMM setup,
That's
because
another brace
there's
right
another
there.
brace.
there's
Okay.
another brace underneath. So
Right.
7. And then slowly we were like, man, I just want a little bit more, like it's so bound up. And I think Sean's maybe was using the 67 mil, and it was like really pinched. Like when you feel it, man, that thing was rigid. And so I was running 70 mil spacers. So I had a little bit more forgiveness, and I started slowly pulling out braces from the shock tower, from the carbon rails, right? From the G-Speed.
Right.
And then I went to the carbon rails, and I pulled out even more. I only ran 1 brace on the shock towers, and there's no rear bumper on the original graphite version, right? So there's no rear bumper brace, and it was just the front roller bumper.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
And
that
had
roller
a brace.
bumper.
Yeah.
That roller bumper.
Yeah.
And so that's that's when it really felt like, damn, there's actually something to this. And then when we built the first plastic or polymer pork belly, and guys were looking at it, like I still braced it up, but I'm like, man, this thing feels weird. But we go and do the waterfall line, right? Super common. And everyone's
This is before 13-inch wheelbase too.
This is before 13-inch.
This is like
wheelbase.
12.5,
Yeah.
12.7,
I think
5.
I think we were doing 12.7.5, right? We're like, we didn't know. And we didn't know what to expect. We're in the waterfall line, and there's the 4 lines plus the cheater line. And I go and do 1, 2, and 3, and I'm like, wow, that thing actually gripped up, right?
Yeah.
And we're kind of, I was talking to Sean, and then I go do line 4, and it gripped up hard. Like it just rolled through that line. And then I'm like, I didn't even do that cheater line. I was like, nah, let's go to the rock wall. And then we did the rock wall redemption line, and it just ran right up it. And no one was running that wall except the only 2 other people that I knew made it was Sean and Son. We go drive this thing, and it wanted to generate grip. And when I was watching it, like I had the body on it at the time, so I couldn't see it. And there's a story about why I love driving the half cab cage now. But anyways, I had the bug body on it, driving it up, and it just wanted to create grip. Even though the tires would spin, it wouldn't slide down. It's like it would want to create, it was loading each corner evenly as much as possible. And that day we didn't really think about it. We just thought, oh man, that actually worked. Did redemption line. Actually did line 2, which is another exit.
Yeah.
And those 2 lines used to be really hard. And so went home, talked to the guys, and that kind of started it. You know, like it went from the parking lot, you know, like, oh man, I don't know if that's going to work, to holy crap, that was probably the best crawler I've ever drove, you know, of anything.
Dude, I mean, the day that you drove mine up the redemption line, like that sold me right there. Cause I'm not gonna lie to you, when we met, dude, and I got that chassis from you, I was skeptical. I'm like, what the fuck did I just buy? Mm-hmm. You know, like what is this thing? Like I'm used to carbon fiber. I'm used to like,
yeah.
And I'm just like,
totally.
I'm like, is this thing 3D printed or what the fuck is this? So anyways, I go and build this thing. And even before the pork belly was even known, that day they were like, oh, that's the pork belly. And I'm like, oh, how the fuck do you guys know about this? Mm-hmm. You know, it's like they saw the white rails. And at the time, it was, I had a whole, it was the Power Wagon with the bed.
Oh, yeah.
And I tell him, like, hey, check it out, dude, I got it built. And you're like looking at me, dude, it's only been like a couple of days. I'm like, yeah, I got it built.
I think we met Wednesday. And
it was a Thursday.
It was Saturday for the barbecue.
Yeah, and
I couldn't believe it.
I got it on Friday.
Did you get it on Friday?
I got it on Friday.
Yeah, it was a Thursday.
Had it on Saturday.
Yeah, and we were just like, dude, I told him, like, dude, you get what color did you get?
Because we were trying out chassis left and right.
I had at that time I had built anything that was at the time out, and I was just like, it's cool. Like it was, like, I was building what everybody else had because I was new to the hobby. Like I didn't know jack shit about crawlers, and here comes this Craigslist ad that I run across, and I'm just like, what is this? I'm like, that looks kind of cool. So I keep hitting them up. I'm like, fucking, I get this chassis, and I'm like I said, I keep referring back to the time we met, the side of the fucking freeway.
Yeah.
I hit this guy up because this guy's the one who kind of brought me into the whole, crawling. And I'm like, bro, you got to hit this guy up. Like, I got this crazy looking fucking chassis. It looks like it's 3D printed, but it's not. It's plastic. I was like, hit him up. And so I send him your info and he hits you up. I'm like, hey, dude, what color did you get? And he goes, at the time, it's either white or black.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, I'll go with the black.
Yeah, so I was like, I hope he got the black one. I don't want,
so we could try something else.
Yeah.
And so then, sure enough, dude, he goes, yeah, I got the black one. I'm like, did you meet up with him? He goes, yeah, I met up with him. I'm like, cool. So here comes this day of the barbecue. And I'm super excited. Everybody's noticing this rig because it's completely fucking different from everything out there. And I give you I'm like, hey, dude, check it out. I built this. And you go, okay. You pick the fucking thing up and you take it straight to the wall. And I'm just like, dude, that wall to me was like, that is impossible.
Yeah. No. When we were crawling there at Linda, we were all talking about this. We're never going to do it.
Yeah, fuck that wall. That wall's crazy. But then again, I was running a TRX4. And then it was like my built G-Speed, which is, at the time was a capable rig. But I was like, there's no way he's going to fucking make it with this thing. And you're sitting there, and I think Ryan recorded the whole thing.
Yeah.
And that video is old. I mean, I think if we go back to that date, it's probably around the same time you started releasing the chassis.
Yeah.
And you walked up that fucking line and you descended down.
Well, it was...
Because it was the rear weight on that.
It was the rear weight. I mean, when I picked it up, it was heavy. But I thought, oh man, you could do the downhill section of Redemption.
Yeah, you turned it, dude. You turned it. He went up it, and I'm just like, I'm watching him just drive this thing, and Ryan's sitting there going like, he's looking at me at the same time he's recording. He's like, what the fuck? He's walking up this thing, and you go all the way up, and then you start bringing it down. And I'm just like, when he gets to the top, I'm like, okay, he's done. Nope. He brings it back down, and he's going the other way, and I'm just like, no fucking way he's gonna bring this thing back down. Sure enough, dude, just boop, 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 comes down, and I'm just like, he has me be like, oh, yeah, it's good, thanks. I'm like,
he calls me over, and he's all like, this guy just did this. I'm like,
he walked it. And I'm like, oh, now at that point, I was like, that's it. That's the chassis. And then it just snowballed to what it is now, man. It's fucking crazy.
That first run, like I actually look for that first sheet. There's 14 of them on each sheet. I remember. And I think I have two. I have two on the wall. Mm-hmm. And I have your original rails.
Yeah, the original one, and then I have another original that I got from Ofer. That he actually, I think he was the first one who bought one from you. Actually bought one from you. But I think it's still the same sheet.
Yeah, and those things are still good. Dude. They're actually, if you the reason why I like those, it's because after the first year when there was still people running them, they actually felt even better.
Yeah, the break-in time.
The break-in time.
Yeah, we called it.
And we at the first run, we didn't know how much to remove for the flex slot, right? Like the dynamics of the material was unknown. Like how far could you go to slim it down to get a particular feel? And we didn't even know how much articulation do you want in the rail, right? So I didn't think about it at the time, but after I think it was when you wore out your chassis. When Edgar wore out his chassis and it broke, and he twisted it so many times it broke at the skid.
Well, that was the thing, that they didn't have that relief cut yet.
They didn't have the relief cut.
So that's the thing that, but I mean, I would grab this thing and just like, hey, check this thing out.
Yeah.
And everybody was just like, oh my God.
But that's what made me think later on in the newer versions, like the ones that you see now, the slimming of the flex slot to get to what you had when you're feeling that, and it's just changed it. I mean, at least for me, the type of feel that you get out of these rigs, it's just unreal. It's almost like just build it. It doesn't have to have the greatest. It doesn't have the highest breakover, right? Clearance. It doesn't have the highest skid angle. It doesn't have any of these other extreme things. But what it does have is the capability to really, and I'll say this over and over again, it's got the capability to unlock the driver mod. That's really it.
Right. But dude, I mean, so when you drove my rig that one day at Linda Vista, you couldn't see the holes that I drilled.
No.
That day. Because I drilled a shitload of different holes on that chassis. Just to do the different. And I didn't bring that up to you until afterwards, because the whole body would just cover everything up.
Yeah.
But I drilled, I want to say, I think 4 or 5 different shock positionings.
To experiment with, right?
Exactly. Because I was just like, I mean, at the time, like I said, I didn't know any about, nothing about it. And I'm just like, I'm the type of guy that I'll grab a chassis or I'll grab someone's rig and I'm like, I'll feel it. I can distinguish like, okay, this is how it's built. Like just by feeling it and just seeing how the suspension kind of reacts. And for some reason, the positioning that at the time that you guys had wasn't like, I don't know, just to me didn't feel right. I mean, to my liking. And again, I'm just basing it off. I'm like, I didn't know jack shit. And I'm like, I'm just gonna drill some holes in this thing. I'm like, it's not carbon fiber. I can just drill right through this thing.
Easy to work with.
Funny thing is, what was that one side had a lopsided hole, but it was the side that I ran the battery on, so it would offset. So I'm like, okay, I'll run my battery on that side since the hole I didn't drill them correctly. You know, I was just kind of eyeballing this shit. I'm like, fuck it, I'm drilling this thing, and I'm like, all right, it feels cool, and I was just blown away. I was. From that day on, dude, I mean, I tried every single chassis out there, every single type of build, and I was just like, no, this is it, dude. This is the chassis, and
it's definitely a particular feel, huh?
Fuck yeah,
oh yes,
man, dude. That I mean, I've driven. I mean, there's a bunch of new stuff out there nowadays. I mean, current time right now, there's a ton of different. But at the time, there was only maybe a handful of chassis you can choose from.
Yeah,
you know, it wasn't a whole lot to choose from at the time, but this was just something different.
Yeah.
Like, the tunability was fucking on point.
Yeah. It was crazy how it would flex and you could have traction on all single tires.
And it wouldn't unload.
Yeah.
It was weird. It was so forgiving. And that's the thing. Like, I called it the Porkbelly high five or the waving. Because it would sit there and you would like
catch yourself.
No, you would want to catch it because that's what I was used to doing with my other rigs. That wasn't a Porkbelly. I would be so paranoid because they would just, when they would offload, they would just fucking just boom, completely offload because they're so rigid. With the Porkbelly, you can offload, but it would just kind of stick. And then if you just let it settle, it would just kind of boom,
come
just
back down.
It was so forgiving. I was like, what the fuck? It was crazy.
Yeah.
And so then that's where I started coming to like, dude, just trust the rig. Because there was times where I remember crawling with you and you were just like trying to catch it. I'm like, dude, just trust it. And you're like, and you would just let it and it would do this crazy recoveries. You're like, oh shit. Like you can completely fall off the line and find this other line where I let the rig just do my driving. And I'm like, okay, it wants to go that way.
It'll find a way.
Yeah, it was hunting.
There was times when we actually just like put it on like slow, just let it
crawl, and
just like it would just find its own way, like kind of like wiggle traction and just
Me and him would get so excited. I mean, we were over the smallest things too, but we didn't see the other rigs do that. It was so like, remember that time we went to Seven Seas?
Yeah.
And we were so excited to hit you up the next day. I'm like, dude, this fucking rig just crawled around this round rock. It just wrapped.
Hanged and wrapped
exactly.
over.
And we're just sitting there going like, what the fuck? Like, dude, we got to do that again. If we can do it again, it's
not a fluke.
Yeah. And sure enough, we kept doing it and doing it. I'm like, oh, dude, we got to tell Eric about this.
Yeah. We didn't know at the time that like that little bit of forgiveness, right, is actually maintaining the capacity of the suspension. Like imagine if you're on uneven terrain, if you could give your 85 mil shock another 5 mil or another 10 mil of dampening or space, right? So if some of that load could be articulated in the chassis first, and then it allows for your shock to continue working. It doesn't bottom out or it doesn't fully extend. And I tell people about this too. Like as soon as you bottom out, there's no other place for that shock to go, right? It's just going to travel wherever it wants. Like you lost the dampening capability of your suspension. With this way, if you've got maybe like the terrain's 10 degrees, 15 degrees, and there's a certain amount of flux within the chassis can take some of that and still maintain the capacity of your shock.
Yeah.
Now that may be maybe people don't look at suspension that way, but when I look at, there's this time where I was doing a lot of hiking, and me and a friend went to Marin, right? And we went for a hike up there. And on the trail, I see this lizard or salamander right on the path.
And he's just...
And this was around the time we were still figuring out the tuning of the V7, the original cut. And I watched it. I come up to the lizard, whatever. It was cool. Checked it out, took pictures, and then I watched it walk off, right, or slither off, and it climbed up some rocks. And right there, I was watching lizards are one of the best crawlers. Like they could crawl on a ceiling, right?
Yeah.
But what makes this thing so good on rocks? And what I noticed was the body of the lizard would conform to the terrain before it would have to really extend its legs, right? So then
so it's still like, had that like,
imagine a lizard doesn't have long legs, right? So then I thought, man, the shocks that we're using don't have a whole lot of shock travel. And Sean had always told me, you don't need shock travel. Like, that's actually bad. You actually only want a tire's worth of travel, right? So we stuck to it. But when we were trying to figure out how to tune the flux, how to understand it, when I thought of that lizard, I was like, oh, that's what it's really doing. It's actually adjusting slightly, just enough where its legs don't have to overwork. So is that what's happening in our chassis design right now, where it doesn't have to overwork the corners, right? It's taking up some of that. And ever since then, I started removing braces.
So everything works with each other. So the shock works with the chassis works with,
and then
the axle and everything.
Yep. And then we I feel like we not maxed out, but we got to the point with the V7, which was the original Porkbelly. We wanted to do revisions. And there was a lot of talk about, can you add more skid angle? Can you do some of this?
We kept bugging about that.
So at some point, I don't know if I told you this before, but you told me a story about you guys were running the Reapers, right? Yes, and they're amazing.
I can't fucking stand them. I'm sorry, but I can't.
They're amazing rigs. CCW Austin, he makes an amazing product in all his line. And so it was like a lot of the community were using the Reaper chassis and talking about that skid angle. And when me and Sean were talking about it, we were like, but it's not really about the angle. Yes, it gives you clearance within the wheelbase if your geometry is the same ratio, right? This is why I talk about ratio. So if you're used to and I go quote unquote, air quotes, 60-40 base, like everyone starts off 60-40 weight ratio, right?
Yep. 60
weight front bias. But when you look at the geometry of the links, what's that ratio? It's almost that, very close. You're going plus or minus, but skid angle at that geometry, right? And maybe I haven't owned a Reaper, but when I look at it, maybe that kick in that geometry is around in that 60-40 range or just forward of it, but it gives you just enough to be noticeable. But what we were seeing with the Porkbelly and the chassis flexing was that on a breakover line, because it would flex, if you had the front axle on there, it would actually kind of twist and want to wrap around the breakover.
Like almost like a headlock on the rock. It's like brings you over.
So I wasn't completely sold on breakover. Like I wanted to add it, but I didn't want to add it
to an extreme,
right, or for the wrong reason. Like if you could get over the same line with the Porkbelly that you could with the Reaper, let's not automatically throw in the angle, right? Let's figure out something else in this. What is it in the setup? And there was a point where I was getting feedback from the team, from Edgar, like, dude, it's doing all the things that this breakover geometry is doing, this Reaper is doing. And it's like, okay, what else can we do? Shock positions, right?
Holes, bro.
Yeah. So should we do shock positions? Should we do this? And it took a long time before we did a different release, a different offering. Yeah. And so I think
it was almost close to a year, no?
Close to over a year, I think.
Yeah. I was just like, dude, I'm like, come on, let's go.
Yeah, you were already on your second Porkbelly. I think it was tan rail.
Oh, the tan rail,
yeah. And then finally, I was talking to Mel one night, and he was like messing around with it because as soon as I'd hear something, I'd give Mel the feedback on the chassis, and I'd call Sean too. Hey, we did this or whatever. And so one night, I was talking to Mel, and he's actually doing he's probably bored, thinking about how do we put angle in here, and so he's got the original Porkbelly clocking the skid, right? And I'm like, man, if you do that, we have to do other things because it's not just skid angle.
Yeah.
And so he's like, well, what are you thinking? And I'm like, if we're going to clock it, but we're going to move it forward. And we can't move too far away from the drive quality and experience that we already have. So you can't go too far forward, but it's to keep the feel, but it's got to have that feeling of, oh, this is a different rig. So not only did we move it forward, but we moved it up in the geometry. And I talk about geometry as in also considering your wheelbase. So if you did apples to apples, you did a 13-inch rig, and a lot of us were really just building 13-inch rigs and doing it from there. Where within that, not just two-dimensional geometry, like the three-dimensional, like the height of the tires too, and the height of your shocks, the height of your weight, where are we going to relocate the skid, right? Because you're also relocating the box of your linkage, front and back. Where do those sit? So we didn't go too far. We moved it a little bit forward. I won't say how much. and we moved
You did that before any of these other rigs. That's something kind of newish, but you guys already had that in the back burner for a while.
Yeah.
Because I remember seeing that chassis and I'm like, this is completely different.
Yeah. And we it took us a while to release it too, because the original was just doing super well. Like people were doing crazy things, at least for the time. But it was also really where we saw the sharing of information, just like how we go to the track. Like if you go to any track, any community, a lot of the guys are running maybe 2, possibly 3 different buggies, and they're all sharing a lot of the setup. It's because they're doing it as a community to get faster, to get better, right? When we were doing these setups, we were doing the same thing. We were sharing where's the weight placement, how much weight distribution, how much weight do you want to build these overall? So we started sharing our setups. So like it's still somewhere on there. Now we shared the lightweight setup, but I think later on you guys were sharing your heavier setups.
Heavier balanced.
Yeah. And I feel like that really started the community, at least in the Bay Area, where, do you have a Juan and Edgar build? Or do you have a Eric Sean build, like a lightweight build? And then you had a mix of those. Like Benton has a kind of a hybrid. Sometimes he goes a little bit up or down. Same with Troy. And it was really cool. Even Mr. Steve of Bark, he had one with the Element axles, and he had his own build. But just the sharing of that knowledge, I think, really escalated the development and performance, not just in the rigs, but the drivers. Because we would get that feedback. Like you share info, you get feedback quickly.
Oh, yes.
And we would incorporate that into even the parts. So when we moved to the PBX line, right away, the adoption from the existing Porkbelly drivers, they were like, yep, I want one. And
there was no break-in point at that one.
I noticed it, but there was barely any break-in point because that had some slimming in it, right? Because we had learned from the V7. And I would tell Sean, dude, I'm not getting full flex until like 3 months. And it was a thick cut.
Yeah,
right?
Dude.
Thick cut.
And then that was like that whole thing we talked about was that break-in point. And we would tell everybody that. I'm like, hey, you know what? It's like, oh, it's not doing what yours is doing. I'm like, hold on, just give it a couple months, and you just gotta drive it.
Yeah,
you know, it's like you're breaking
ruptures.
I was gonna say that.
You gotta break them in.
I love ruptures, but when they're brand new, they're just like, it's torture because you need to break those in and get those lugs really soft, and a brand new rupture doesn't have that. But give it like maybe 2 or 3 packs, even at Bean Hollow, just a day at Bean Hollow will break in a rupture.
They'll come in.
They're perfect.
They'll scrub in, the carcass gets soft, the inserts get softer. They work in, and it started to become that messaging, that communication of like, hey, build it this way, but expect within the first month
make some adjustments
because it's
going to react different, dude. And I noticed that where there would be days when it's freshly built, like it's brand new, not a speckled duster, whatever, it's a brand new rig and it's doing this cool shit, and then like couple months later, it's like, oh shit, it's reacting completely different.
It's getting better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then you make adjustments on your shock positioning or on your link geometry. You put a riser on, or you bring the riser down, or you just change shit around and you make those adjustments until where you feel content on how the rig's reacting. Like, okay, cool. Now I know what it's going to do. That's where it's going to stay. But now with these new chassis, I mean, everything's just boom, instant. And
Dude, right out of the bag, they feel super good.
they're just like, oh, there's no breaking point, and it shows a lot from where you guys came from.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, there's a breaking point. To now we're just like, just fucking build the thing, go drive it, dude, and you're gonna just be like, oh shit.
Yeah. We definitely have some time in how to tune these, how they develop, and it's just cool. Like I'll say this too. I'm a fan of all our Porkbelly drivers out there, all of our customers, because when I see them accomplishing stuff that they've never done, like that's
The reactions
win.
alone.
It's so fun.
Yeah.
It's so fun. You know, and I'm not saying that other rigs can't be super capable, but there's something about whether it's the forgiveness in the articulation of the chassis, it's adding just that bit of performance, and then the knowledge base though. When the community shares a setup that's obviously working on video, we share a lot of video, right? Like if it's on the video, we're trying to share what we did in setup changes, in any kind of new parts. That's why I wanted to, like, here on the table, I have a remake of my budget bug, where how could you just take very simple parts? It's got a Crawlmaster Sport 13 turn 540 motor, nothing fancy. It's got a 3-gear plastic trans. It actually has plastic gears in it. I think Dan Thompson might have used one in his G-Shot, which I hope he brings back. Suit, and I actually lightened the 3-gear, but that's inexpensive. It's a $15 motor, a $20 trans, if that. It's got a NSDRC 700 servo and a 1080, not even the new one, just a 1080 ESC. But this is a remake of my budget bug that when I first went to Proline, I had it. And it's on Capra axles, plastic rear, and eventually I'll probably swap out the front to a KYX axle housing just for weight bias, just for a little bit of strength. And then the weight bias, I think it's just under 200 grams, so it's quite a bit heavier than even a Super Shafty or Trio, so it's heavyweight. I probably add a little bit more and then aim for like a 5 1/4 rig. I'll probably put ruptures or monolithics on it with Proline dual stage foams. Those aren't the latest and greatest dual stage foams, but they're available. So the purpose of this build is to really focus on these parts are available at a hobby shop, right? Like you can easily source it, and then we're going to go see how hard we can go with it. Yeah. And we've got some new flavor on it that we've been testing. I mean, we just released some of the flex braces that we use. So those are on our site.
In there.
Yeah. So I've been running that for the past about year and a half on my 4-wheel steer and drag axle on my PBX. And so far, I've been loving them. We've got a few more things, and Edgar just saw it. But we've got
I wasn't sure if you had it on here.
Oh, it's on there.
Okay. So we'll just leave it alone.
Yeah, we'll bring that up next time.
Yeah.
But that one, we have another.
I'm excited for that. Actually, to be honest,
you should be excited.
I am.
So I tested a new thing, a new chassis tuning part over the weekend when we were at Bean Hollow on my PBX. And I've been doing some interesting setup changes to my PBX, and it's mostly to go have fun at Proline and play with the Poise guys and whatever and do some hardline stuff. But it's got 2.2 IBEX on it now. It's going to get stretched a little bit, but I'm tuning the flux even more. And what I'm looking for...
That's going to be fun, dude.
Yeah.
Wait, just wait.
Yeah, it'll be good.
You'll see.
What I'm looking for is how do you make the flex and articulation smooth, right? Like the smoothness of flex now, plus slowing it down. Like there's just tuning it even more. But what I can say is from my tests so far, it's even more plush, if you can imagine. Like when you have a feature like what you're talking about, when it's wrapping around a rock,
It's a smooth transition.
Smooth transition, and it wants to like almost grip, like the chassis wants to compress around terrain. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe later on. I'll show you the parts later.
We'll figure it out. Dude. That's for a later conversation.
Yeah, but really just trying to focus on how do we give our community and RC community in general more value, right? Like if you have answers within an affordable budget, or you can go super baller, why not deliver something within the backbone itself that's going to give you dampened articulation already, improve your suspension, improve your traction, even in high grip terrain where maybe you're just bound up and you're in a V crack and you're trying to squeeze out. Like Greg Bosworth, it's on our team. He's doing ridiculous stuff with this
that
sport
guy,
kit.
bro. I mean, and I strive to be like that dude. I mean, it's fucking crazy the shit that he's coming up with.
Amazing.
Upside down.
Yeah.
Doing. Have you seen the video?
I saw that
dude,
video.
I was just like, you remember those old McDonald toys that you can flip the cars around?
Yeah.
That's what his rig reminds me of.
Ridiculous.
He's just sitting there like, oh, let me try this. And he's just like, oh yeah, I'll do it. And it's just like, dude, you're upside down going in fucking reverse. You legit have to steer and use reverse. Yeah. And this guy's just walking like it. Like, it's like, it's second nature to him. Like, it's fucking crazy.
Him and JD, John Davis out at Folsom. Those guys are like
pushing limits out there.
Yeah.
Those guys are ridiculous, and they build the same. What I love about
it's like pairs.
It's in pairs.
It's in pairs. Yeah, and that's kind of part of the essence of how we do RC, where these really encourage your buddy to go get one, and then it escalates from there, where you just want to share. Dude, I did this. Oh yeah, like show me and how'd you do it? You actually really compelled to share your setup with your friends that are running the same thing, and then trying to help each other, like figure out what that technique is, that drive skill, that driver mod, right? And we even have like Greg and JD, they talk about this quite a bit when we're hanging out, at least before. Like they never crawled with each other before Porkbelly. And now they were like when we had the meet here, they were like, we talk to each other almost every day about stuff, and to be able to bring a type of community that opens up, like strangers can be best friends, like that to me, I'm already used to from the track. Like I got buddies like our buddy Jerry. I've raced with him for, 14 years. Julian for about that since 2012 maybe. Ramel, we actually raced in high school, and then Sean, I met at Castle Hobbies. We raced Nitro, in like 2002,
Nitro?
something
What's Nitro?
Like that. Yeah, that's Nitro. But there's something about RC in general that
brings people together.
It brings people together. So when we were talking about Res and what I had envisioned of what this brand could be, it could be something like that, where it just gives people an excuse to bond, have that bond with each other, in an interesting way, in a fun way.
It definitely does. Cool.
Well, man, thanks for being on the show and sharing your experiences with us and your growth. And like I said, we appreciate everything you do for us, man.
Right on.
So much.
I think
Well, I appreciate you guys.
Make everything fun, man.
Yeah. And congratulations on the podcast and the YouTube channel.
Thank you.
I watch every single one. My notification, like ding.
Just hit that like button.
Yeah. Hit that like button. Follow, subscribe.
Follow.
Everybody out there, it's a good show.
Definitely. Thank you.
Well, thanks for being on here with us.
Awesome.
All right.
Cool.
See you guys out on the
See you
rocks.
next time.
Later.
Thank you for joining us in another episode of RC Crawlers and Coffee. Did you get the trailer you're aching for? If so, join us next time for more RC wisdom and pro tips. Till then, happy crawling!